Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here today with Bill Schofield and John Harrigan. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Howdy.
Well, we're excited today. We want to tackle your questions. Today is our second of perhaps many more Q&A episodes. And we just want to start off again by saying thank you to our listeners. You know, we really have enjoyed getting your feedback. The things you've sent us on Twitter and maybe retweeted or reposted things, the emails you've sent us of encouragement and all the questions and stuff. We're in awe of the way that this podcast has been received by so many from around the world. So thank you, listeners, for the way that you've encouraged us. And we hope that we continue to be an encouragement to you. So do us a favor, give us a rating or a review. So if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or something, there's a way you can go down and kind of give us like a little 5-star rating or however many stars you really want to give us. But 5 stars would be awesome. And that really helps to spread the podcast in terms of when people search for it or how it gets ranked and displayed on other parts of the interwebs. So yeah, that'd be super awesome if you could do that for us.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to give a special thanks to Tyson Raines for him doing the artwork for us for the podcast. He's really gifted, and if you haven't seen his new book, Jesus and His White Horse, I would recommend getting on Amazon. It's a great kid's book, and he's really gifted as far as art and design, illustration. He's really superb. So thank you, Tyson.
Tyson lives in the great state of Texas, just like me, and we love Texas. So thanks for being in Texas, Tyson. That's good. All right. Talk a little bit about our website once again. If you are not aware, we have a whole bunch of resources, a list of resources on our website where we just look at a bunch of books or articles or even some documentaries that really develop the idea of first century Jewish apocalyptic. And so if you have not seen the resources section on our website, definitely go and check that out at apocalypticgospel.com. You'll see a link at the top called resources, and we've got a whole bunch there. Also, if you're not aware, each of us, John and Bill and I, have our own YouTube channels where we have short little videos where we sometimes work through a passage of scripture or a concept or something related to a lot of the content on this podcast. So definitely search YouTube for our names, or you can go to our website, and on our website, we also have links to our individual YouTube channels. And again, I'm sure many of you have seen on our website, we have a contact form for questions or comments. So go ahead and use that. I know many of you have. So go ahead and continue to use that. We love hearing from you. That's just on apocalypticgospel.com, and you'll see a contact link at the top. And finally, we have a donate link on our website as well, because this podcast does cost a little bit just in terms of hosting it and the fees to get it distributed. We use a service that gets it out to all the major platforms. And so if that interests you, that you want to help us out in that aspect, we would be super grateful. So with that said, let's jump into our questions today. We've received a whole bunch, and so we've kind of combined some and
Whole bunch.
Yeah, and this is awesome. We love this. So first question comes to us from David, and several of you sent questions related to how to disciple someone or how pastors should teach the content of these things from the pulpit. So this one comes from David, and he says, as a part-time lay teacher in my church, I desire to teach the gospel in the context of the apocalyptic narrative. However, I find I focus on the cross less. How can I teach on the cross more while staying true to the Jewish narrative? Well, first, David, I'll just say this, that our last 2 episodes 11 and 12 of our podcast, we actually develop how the cross was understood within a first century Jewish apocalyptic perspective. And so definitely, if you haven't had a chance to listen to those episodes, we'd encourage you to go check those out, because the cross doesn't have to be separate from how Jews would have understood the day of God, the day of judgment. In fact, it is central to understanding those things. So go ahead and listen to those last couple of episodes.
Yeah, I'll say too, David. Yeah, like he said, those two subjects aren't really at odds at all. And I realized that generally, especially in evangelical context, the cross is taught in a way that feels like it's at odds, because it's taught as in terms of the quote unquote finished work of the cross, assuming that what that references is that your salvation was completed in the past. And so to anticipate something in the future feels different than to look back with gratitude at what God did in the cross. And that's just not the case. So like Josh said, I think that's really helpful. Those two episodes, hopefully that they can maybe help you continue a focus on the cross while also explaining it in terms of first century Jewish narrative. I'd also like to say, just in terms of, because we did get a lot of questions, which awesome. Praise the Lord that we got a lot of questions about people wanting to disciple others in terms of basically understanding the narrative better. And one thing I'll say is, from the pulpit, it's one thing. And, in an individual sense, it's a little bit different. But keep in mind, and I may have even said this last time, I don't remember because I end up giving this advice often. Keep in mind that when you ask questions that people, or when you answer questions that people aren't asking, sometimes it stirs up more curiosity than they need to actually just hear the gospel and obey it. So from the pulpit, like when I'm teaching to a wider group of people, I teach very differently than I do with a few people that I know they aspire to be teachers. They want to understand everything from start to finish so that they have a more robust vision of what they're sharing. So I do it very differently from the pulpit. And just to give 20-second answer to how I would do it is I simply teach people to obey the words of Jesus. So I think generally that's how it was framed for the original disciples. Granted, we don't have the perspective that they all had going into it, but just simple obedience to the words of Jesus, I think, is a really good way to start. And because the words of Jesus actually confront the worldview issue pretty adequately, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, what's going on in this whole podcast is basically a reorientation of eschatology. That's what it mostly boils down to, is trying to flesh out how Jews viewed the future in the first century. And we call this apocalyptic because the future is moving towards a climactic apocalyptic end, the day of God, the judgment, the resurrection, which leads to two ages. So when the cross and the mercy of God, that can be interpreted in various number of different eschatologies. So a lot of times in the West, you'll get the cross within almost a naturalistic eschatology. God died for you because he loves you and wants you to have a great life. He wants you to be blessed and have food and clothing and housing, and he wants you to be happy. Like there's nothing beyond that eschatology. It's just this life. It's just survival, whatever. And so most of the time the cross gets taught within kind of a Western, that derives back to Greco-Roman roots, a Western eschatology of kind of an immaterial heavenly destiny. So Christ died for you so that you could go to heaven, an immaterialized singular heaven. And so eschatology is usually assumed within that preaching of the cross and the mercy of God. So mostly what's happening within this whole podcast is simply fleshing out first century Jewish eschatology. So if you take, Romans 5, that where Paul says, "But God proves his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. How much more then, since we've been justified by his blood, shall we be saved from the wrath to come. So the wrath to come is the assumed Jewish eschatology. And so instead of Christ died for us so we could go to heaven, it's Christ died for us to justify us before the coming judgment, that we might stand blameless at his appearing on the day of wrath. So it's really just a redefinition of kind of the flow of redemptive history, how Jews viewed the universe and the future. And the preaching of the love and mercy of God within that actually, I think, makes much more sense when you have the severity and intensity of the first century, Jewish apocalyptic view of God and history.
Yeah. Great, guys. Great. Well, let's move on to our next question. David, we hope that was helpful. Our next question, we've received a few questions about additional resources or, maybe seminaries that would teach this perspective, first century Jewish apocalyptic. And Emily sent us a question about seminaries, and Josh sent us a question about where to find more resources on first century Jewish apocalyptic. And I think maybe the three of us were talking a little bit before about perhaps just talking about some of the groups in the West today that have the largest influence in terms of theology and the way that we think. And so we just wanted to develop some of the positive aspects of each of those large groups and large maybe ways of thinking or ways of interpretation of the scripture. And really because it's not like we can't really just kind of say, oh, well, go to this seminary or read that one single book and that'll answer all your questions. Just because, again, there's a mix of a lot of stuff going on here.
Yeah, so this is always a difficult question. Everybody always asks, where can I go for more reading, more teaching on these themes? And it's always difficult because it's complicated. Life is complicated, yep. And there's lots of different agendas, and you have a myriad of different groups and camps, theologies that are backed by lots of different agendas, publishing houses, seminaries, all kinds of things. So generally, as far as influence in the West, you have four or so major kind of camps. You have dispensationalist camps, you have Reformed camps, you have historical or secular camps, and you have charismatic camps. And so within those four major camps, your different publishing houses and your different seminaries, colleges, training institutions will kind of fall within those. And when we say camps, we mean like kind of groupings of thought. Of course, Reformed is very much more denominational, usually in orientation, but a dispensational can be Baptist, a dispensational can be Pentecostal, a dispensational can be all kinds of, Mennonite brethren, all kinds of different camps, like denominations can hold to one kind of theological worldview. And different seminaries will hold different places. Evangelicalism, for example, 50 years ago was much more dispensational at its center, whereas now evangelicalism is much more reformed. And so probably as far as a movement, the one that is most apocalyptic historically is dispensationalism. And I like to think of dispensationalism like it's a similar sound to first century Jewish apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Late great planet Earth, Armageddon now, whatever all the, names are. It's got like an eschatological focus. It's got like a similar sound, but it's just completely out of tune. Like it's just like the whole, and you read dispensationalist stuff and it's just like, wait, a first century Jew, that's just weirdness. The whole dispensations and the intercalation and then the secret rapture and all these things. Like a first century Jew would just be like, what are you talking about? Uh-huh. But of course, an emphasis on eschatology and the judgment and the coming of the Messiah and Jewish election, these things actually, you'll hear about these things in dispensationalism more than you will in other camps or groups.
Yeah. And I think kind of going off of that, I'll just tackle the charismatic world. I think the three of us have come from some sort of charismatic world, other ones as well. But I think with the charismatic world, the issue isn't so much that the sound is out of tune, but just that there's several sounds that should be heard in kind of in harmony. But the sound of the charismatic world is the one note that you hear. It's like the guitar player coming and going, bah! And that's the only thing you hear, right? Is, oh, it's signs and wonders and the Spirit and all of these things. But of course, there's no talk of apocalyptic typically in the charismatic world, but the emphasis on signs and wonders, the emphasis on healing, the activity of the Holy Spirit, prophecy, dreams and visions, these things are awesome. And the charismatic world really emphasizes those things, but just doesn't have the anchor in the day of Christ, in the age to come, in the resurrection of the dead, as a first century Jew would have had. So it's not that the sound is necessarily wrong. It's just not harmonized with the other sounds. And it's got, it's maybe the only sound you hear as opposed to the harmonization of all of those sounds, to make the beautiful tunes of first century Jewish apocalyptic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And just in terms of a historical, you'd have, prominent places. You can think of places like Harvard and Yale right now, which obviously didn't originate as historical secular, but they are. And, it's not that you can't find anything believing there, although generally that's the exception. It's just that you have to understand what you're studying for. And because there are definitely fields of study or even courses of study that you could take there that are really helpful in terms of getting a more robust view and understanding, but you just have to know what you're getting into. Generally not faith-based at all. Generally, probably most of the biblical scholars and a lot of these departments don't actually believe in what they'll be teaching. And so some people can deal with that better than others. And so that's the other world, and you just got to learn how to balance all that.
Yeah, and as far as Reformed camps, it depends on how Reformed you are, how kind of Calvin cult it is, but usually in Reformed circles, Jewish apocalyptic is the antithesis to a theology of the cross. And so in that context, I find it very difficult to have honest conversations. So as far as schools, going to seminary and resources, I would say, a conservative evangelical school that's not necessarily reformed and bent, like Denver Seminary or Fuller. Fuller's gotten pretty obnoxiously liberal. Regent, Trinity, Asbury, something along those lines, where you can do kind of objective study, historical study, and not get squashed by your teachers dogmatically. Whereas if you go to a reformed seminary, RTS or something, they're pretty hardcore. Dispensationalist schools, DTS is a good school. Beyond that, Biola, also Talbot's a good school. But the farther you go down that road, Moody and Grace and all those schools, that you're just not going to hear that much about Jewish apocalyptic. You're just going to get kind of an inductive, traditional kind of dispensational rehashing over and over. If you're of the mindset where you don't really care what unbelievers say, then I would recommend a secular school like Duke or Princeton or Candler or something, where you can do kind of honest historical. You can't ever frame your conclusions on the basis of faith. There's no application. It's just what it was in history. So if you can keep things in history, then those schools will be tolerable to you. But if you feel the need, like we do, to apply it today, then those schools probably aren't going to work out too well for you.
Right. Exactly. Well, it's good, guys. Let's move on to our next question then.
Okay, so our next question is from a friend of ours, from Joel Richardson, and he asked, why is it that many evangelicals today recognize and embrace the first century Jewish supernatural worldview as taught so well by Dr. Heiser, while ignoring or rejecting outright first century Jewish eschatology? So if you want to kind of give an intro to Mike Heiser, Josh, and give some context to that question.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with Michael Heiser, he's an Old Testament scholar who studied ancient history, Hebrew Bible, Semitic languages, and he has real expertise when it comes to the scripture's understanding of things like divine beings, angels, demons, the divine council. And I remember I first heard about him through his book, The Unseen Realm, where he really breaks down what I think many in modern evangelicalism would see as kind of the weird stuff in the Bible, like how the ancient world understood the gods, spiritual beings, and the occult. And I think that a lot of what he has to say along those lines is phenomenal. I mean, I had no idea like what a passage like Psalm 82 was about, and that the God of Israel actually even had a divine council. And so I'd say for me, it was probably Heiser from the Old Testament, along with maybe someone like Paula Fredrickson from the New Testament, that really opened my understanding of things related to the Elohim, the worship of other gods in ancient cultures, etc. But again, Heiser is an Old Testament guy, and that's what his training was in, and that's what his research has been all about. And he really is a prolific writer and speaker in that field. But I think that is really where I would stop engaging with Heiser, because as Joel implied in his question, guys like Heiser and others who recognize and embrace this kind of perspective on how the Jewish people would have understood the hierarchy of divine beings or the gods or the powers in the heavens, these kinds of things, they often tend to either completely ignore or utterly reject the Jewish view of eschatology. So I remember a couple of years ago when I was actually working through Heiser's teachings on Leviticus. I mean, amazing content when it comes to Leviticus and the Old Testament in general. But the content, I mean, at least when he came maybe to the last 10 minutes of the teaching, is usually when he started talking about how everything he had been working through, how it all connected to Hebrews or to Jesus or to the eschatology of the apostles. And I learned that after the first few teachings I listened to, I learned that that was the time to turn it off, because he would say things like, well, and aren't you glad that all that stuff that I just talked about for the last 45 minutes doesn't even matter anymore? And it was kind of shocking, honestly. And I think there's this trendy thing to do in some of the evangelical world today, is really to develop all the detail on what the Jews believed about these things and how they were expecting this radical intervention on this apocalyptic day of God, where he would defeat their enemies, punish the powers in the heavens, raise the dead, send his Messiah, usher in a new heavens and a new earth, etc. But rather than saying that Jesus and the apostles affirmed those things and still expected those things, that instead he came and redefined or reimagined all those Jewish eschatological expectations, or they happened, and that Jesus came and changed the story, and he started a new people called the church and did away with the whole Jewish system, right? And so that's just crazy. Like, how do you come to that conclusion with so much solid Old Testament and Second Temple literature really under your belt? Like, maybe you won't be rejected by your fellow scholars if you affirm the 21st century Western evangelical narrative, especially if your Old Testament stuff is already a little weird, right? I mean, I don't know. But I think what is clear, though, is that the strong theological bias in a particular direction can really impede a historical reconstruction of the scriptures. And Heiser isn't the only one to do this. I mean, I'd throw N.T. Wright in the same category. But there's some historical reasons, I think, why Jewish Apocalyptic has been rejected by many in the academy. We've talked about that a little bit in some of our past episodes. I think of someone like Klaus Koch. His little book called A Rediscovery of Apocalyptic, super, super helpful.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it is very popular, of course. I mean, N.T. Wright is the most popular scholar in the evangelical world, and that is I mean, the guy literally wouldn't have books if that weren't a style. That's like all he does is he uncovers ancient context and then explains very eloquently how that's not what's going on, or how those were all overturned. So Mike, yeah, like you said, Mike's an incredible Old Testament scholar. He has a really robust view of the Old Testament, not only because he is actually a believer, but because he has some real training in a lot of critical areas, and so it's really robust what Mike brings to the table. I've actually read Mike long before his book came out. I probably 10 or 12 years I've tracked with Mike a little bit from his blog, but again, when he gets to the New Testament, this happens, and you'll find this happens with a lot of scholars. What they do is when they reach beyond their field of expertise, they rely on the consensus of a certain group that they feel comfortable with.
Right.
And so Mike just relies on the consensus of evangelical New Testament scholars. And so it's an assumption that, realized eschatology is generally an assumption that he gets to that he doesn't even really address. Sometimes he'll go, see, it's right, but he doesn't actually attempt to prove it because he knows his audience isn't questioning realized eschatology. So, I mean, yeah, it's picking and choosing. Like Joel's right, it's picking and choosing. Let's take the first century supernaturalist worldview, but ignore Jewish eschatology. But that's been going on for a long time. Unfortunately, it's inconsistent, but it's probably going to continue. Unfortunately,
yeah, and this is Heiser has to maintain a kind of. He's not really within the guild. I mean, he's on staff at Logos, but the academic guild has kind of unspoken rules. And when you're part of camps, you don't just end up there accidentally. It takes it's hard to get in those situations and stay in those situations and maintain a reputation. And so once you get into the guild in particular circles, you have to maintain your place within those circles, within those publishing houses, within those academic institutions, within those denominations. And so there's a long history in the 20th century of historical scholars talking about the embarrassment of apocalyptic. And Josh, you mentioned Klaus Koch's book. In German, it was originally titled The Embarrassment of the Apocalyptic, or Confused About Apocalyptic, or At a Loss Over Apocalyptic. But when it got published in English, it was The Rediscovery of Apocalyptic. And so there's a long history of historical scholars saying this is obviously how Jews viewed the universe and the future. And this is obviously what they meant by the resurrection, the kingdom, the age to come, the day of the Lord in Gehenna, the kingdom of God. Like, this is obviously what they're talking about. And they use these things in the New Testament without definition. And you evangelicals want to hold up your dogmatic statements from, dating back to the Reformation. You want to hold up your institutions. But we think the only reason you won't come to terms with the Jewishness, the first century Jewishness of Jesus and the apostles, is because you're embarrassed about it. And so people like, for example, Bart Ehrman, who is an obnoxious twit, if you know Bart, but take his book on Jesus, the millennial prophet, and he basically introduces his book on Jesus doing a survey of apocalyptic cults throughout Christian history and says, why does Christian history keep producing these apocalyptic cults? Well, it's because Jesus was actually apocalyptic, and these groups are revivalist movements of the original thing that was in Jesus. And then he goes on, to kind of flesh that out and hammer the evangelicals, which is something all those guys, they just love to hammer the evangelicals. And so it's a strange dynamic that Jewish apocalyptic thought there is kind of a consensus in the evangelical guild of a bias or an embarrassment about it. And I think the main thing is they don't want God, Jesus being God in the flesh, they don't want God to be both Jewish and apocalyptic, because if God is Jewish, then it's racist. And if God is apocalyptic, then we're associated with sectarian groups throughout church history and Hal Lindsey and the fundamentalists, and we can't be associated with them. Don't ever use the F word. You cannot use the F word. Fundamentalist is the worst. Yeah. So these are some of the dynamics of why you won't hear, it won't happen. You won't hear John Piper, G.K. Beale, Tim Keller. You won't ever hear them talk about Jewish apocalyptic. It's just not going to happen, because there's such a long history and it's such an ingrained system. And I think that's just part of how it goes, and you come to terms with it and move on and don't let it annoy you.
Yeah.
That's it.
Let me jump in here the next question. So this is kind of two questions together, although there were other questions that were related, but about sharing the gospel. So the first one is a particular context, and the second one is probably more of like a local American context. So first one is from Tanner. It says, Tanner says, I've been listening to your new podcast. It has been outstanding. I have a question relating to some of the recent discussions, and I've been unable to escape this reality of true biblical discipleship rooted in the day of the Lord. I'm currently living and laboring cross-culturally, and my deep desire is to see this discipleship culture established. But if I'm honest, it seems like the overwhelming majority of discipleship is simply founded on living right unto achieving a morally high standard of living, rather than discipleship informed by the coming day of God. I'm recognizing that either I am not aware or connected to people who are actually doing this type of discipleship, or it's genuinely scarce in the body today. So I say all of that to say, how do you guys think that this can be reduced into a reproducible culture among people who have no grid for a first century Jewish apocalyptic worldview? In other words, what are practical steps in establishing this framework from ground zero? And Becky asked another very similar one, but probably more in a local context. I'd love to hear, says Becky, you all talk about how to share the gospel with someone who has no concept of God, Jesus, and the Bible.
Great questions.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. This kind of relates to our Great Commission episode and the discipleship of the Gentiles, and the purpose of the Great Commission is actually to disciple the Gentiles into the Jewish apocalyptic perspective, view of God and history, that Jesus has been given all authority in heaven and earth to judge the living and the dead, and that he's with us to the end of this age unto the time of judgment. He's given us the Holy Spirit to baptize and teach and disciple the Gentiles, and in that context, those without the scriptures and the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the future. So for example, Acts 17 is a very insightful moment, because usually when Paul's out among the Gentiles, the Gentiles are already preconditioned because of their association with the synagogue system. So they have kind of a preconditioned view of history. So it's a little bit like, I'm in the Muslim world, and Muslims have a preconditioned Jewish view of history because they picked it up. Muhammad originally picked it up from the Jews living in Arabia, because that was the only place Jews could go to be free from Gentile tyranny back then. Completely free. Arabia was it. So Muhammad picked up the Jewish narrative that history started with Adam, the prophets, and he had a very oral, limited, and so we still get that today. So when I'm discipling a Muslim, I don't have to tell a Muslim where the future of the world is headed. They're not like Hindus. They're not like Buddhists. They're not like naturalists. They don't question the existence of God. They don't question. I ask 100 Muslims on the street, 98% of them here in Cairo will say the earth is 6,000 years old. Just no question. Absolutely not. a very small percentage are influenced by evolutionary and naturalistic thought. So, and Muslims don't have they all know history is moving towards the day of judgment, and it's a society cultural anxiety about how to deal with that and how to be right with God and how to find forgiveness of sins. So with a Muslim, you don't have to explain history. They've been discipled into that. They have to know that God so loved the world that he gave his son as a sacrifice. So they don't have the sacrificial idea, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin. So you have to zero in on that reality. Not the same in the West, where evolution has begun to prevail. You have to explain history and get in heated debates about the reality of history, both past and future. Acts 17 is a good example where it's just complete ignorance, where you have in Athens guys who it's complete ignorance about the Jewish narrative of history. So Paul starts with the beginning, does a basic overview, doesn't get into, the weeds, but does a forest view and culminates with the coming judgment and literal day of God. And so I think this is how you introduce it, and it's how you teach you teach a class, you teach language, you teach whatever, you teach the broad, and then you zero in and you teach it again with more detail. And then you teach it again with more detail. Yeah. And you teach it again with more detail. Yeah. And so I think that's how you introduce it in a broad way. And then you drill down and you keep hammering the same ideas over and over and over.
That's great. Yeah. So in terms of discipleship, one name I'd like to throw out there is that's influenced me in the past is George Patterson. George Patterson is if you're in the missions world, you probably know George Patterson. But one of the things that he's well known for in the missions world is just developing this system of discipleship that I mentioned before, actually. Just teach people to obey Jesus. Now, he kind of has a list of things that he says are obeying the commands of Jesus, which are a little bit goofy, but I think he's right on. Just simply making disciples by teaching the commands of Jesus is very helpful. In terms of presenting the gospel, I am 130% in agreement with what John said, and especially in a Western context where naturalism is so prevalent. I mean, even amongst Christians, naturalism is really prevalent, and at least some form of it. And I find what's really helpful, and probably why you find Paul in Acts 17 laying it out like that, is because to present history, the gospel is essentially the outcome of history, is to basically make it is basically to make it something that's objective, and it's somewhat of a crisis that people have to deal with. And so the gospel really answers the crisis. And so the problem a lot of times is that people don't have the crisis, and so they try to present it as like, well, you got fired from your job. Well, Jesus has a better job for you. And so, but that's not the crisis that the gospel's answering. And so I like this idea of presenting history as leading towards this day of crisis as an explanation or as framework for the gospel. So I frequently will share the gospel by using a timeline, whether it's on a napkin or a sheet of paper. I just write down a timeline, the beginning, the end, the cross, the covenants, explaining the promises of God and how things were going to culminate. And often that, just a little diagram for me, has been really helpful, if not for convincing people of the gospel, at least convincing them that there is a crisis.
Yeah.
And making them think about a crisis. And they go, whoa, okay. And in the Western context, I particularly like the fact that a timeline presents the gospel as an objective reality. Actually has nothing to do with you accepting it or not. The day's coming.
Right.
Right.
Like that's coming. It's a train. You can get on or not get on. Your belief, your acceptance doesn't change the fact.
Yeah.
And I think that is particularly helpful in a Western context.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that completely, Bill, for sure. I mean, I've found the same to be the case using a timeline and just the simple statement of, hey, the world is not always going to be this way.
Amen.
I think that is, for me, what's been super, super helpful in terms of discipling. All right. Next question comes from Harmon. And Harmon actually wrote into us twice. And so we wanted to definitely spend some time talking about his question. He asked, how do you think the Messianic Jews perceived the destruction of the temple in 70 AD in relation to the teaching of Jesus and the apostles? Do you think they expected the Messiah to return in their lifetime or during that time? And related to this question, if I may take the boldness to ask another question, what are your thoughts on the accounts of Josephus in Jewish Wars 653 and Tacitus claiming to have seen riders on chariots in the air surrounding the time of the destruction of the temple? As a historic premillennialist, I personally find this a difficult topic when dealing with preterism. Now, just quickly, if you're not familiar with preterism is simply a way of viewing and understanding the prophecies from the law and the prophets and the words of Jesus as having some sort of fulfillment or brought to their culmination or brought to their completion or whatever at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And there's, various views on the spectrum of preterism where you get, some would call themselves partial preterists, where they would say, well, most of those prophecies have been completed and fulfilled through the events of 70 AD. And then you get some that might say that they are full preterists, they would say, oh yeah, everything, including the second coming, happened in 70 AD. And of course, that is, a blatant, outright, heretical, stupid way of looking at the scriptures. Very well said. So yeah, there's a little bit on preterism. So what would we say to Harmon, about his question?
So let me take a stab at this. So, first, it seems clear, just being objective, it seems really clear that the apostles expected the return of Jesus in their lifetime and did not probably anticipate the destruction of the temple. I understand Matthew 24, but however they ended up processing the information, they think the Lord's going to come in their lifetime, seems like. And so 80-70, how do they process it? Well, we have a little bit probably from the New Testament that's looking back on 70 AD, but not a lot. What seems like it happened generally is kind of what happened with a lot of believers in history, right? They anticipated it's happening now. This is what the prophet said, so we anticipate this happening. And when it doesn't happen, the believing community has their faith tested, and then they just shift forward. Okay, well, it didn't happen when we thought, but that doesn't change the faithfulness of God. So you have, John the Revelator writing after that period and really reaffirming the apocalyptic expectation despite the destruction of the temple. So it's one, they did, but they did like when Cyrus sent them back from Babylon, right? And they went back and they were like, oh man, everything the prophet said. And then they saw the layout of the temple and how puny and insignificant it was, and they wept. The old guys wept because they had seen the splendor of Solomon's temple. And so there's clearly a disillusionment at that outcome because what they anticipated was all that Jeremiah and Ezekiel had said. But what does the Lord do then? He raises up Zechariah and Haggai and Malachi during that next generation to reaffirm what the prophet said. It's still coming in the future. Don't lose heart. It's still coming. And so it's the same thing. The Lord did the same thing with them. And certainly we are, we believe they were right and just reorienting things towards the future. And certainly all the very first writings of the disciples of the apostles and even the second generation after that, all of them affirmed that all of those things were being projected into the future, and that's everything the apostles taught unto their death. And lastly, that this seems like a minor point and might not be relevant to a lot of people, but it is interesting. So in Josephus and in Tacitus, there's a passage referencing AD 70, how there was the sound, or I'm sorry, actually a vision of riders and chariots in the sky during the period of the siege of the temple. And super interesting, and as preterism, the revival of preterism, in the last 20 years, they've found new material, and 2020's definitely going to put a damper on the popularity of preterism, but this is one of the little pet topics that comes up. And so the fact is that to say that there were armies there was not only not a statement that it was the second coming. It's not affirming what Enoch affirmed or and Zechariah affirmed the Lord will come with all of his, the thousands of his holy ones. It's not to reaffirm that, but it's actually not even explicitly Christian. It's not even explicitly Jewish. It was an ancient discussion about certain battles that basically was a way to reiterate that there was divine judgment involved. We might be familiar from a couple accounts in the Bible, like 2 Kings 6:17, where the prophet opens up his servant's eyes to see all the riders and chariots on the mountain surrounding them, more of those who are on our side than are on their side, and the Lord thwarted that attack. And so obviously the Lord did that to give charismatics a lot of really good sermons, really low-hanging fruit sermons. But you have it again in 2 Maccabees, where it talks about Antiochus going into Egypt, and says at that time, and this is 2 Maccabees 5, Antiochus made a second invasion of Egypt, and it happened for almost 40 days. There appeared over all the city golden-clad cavalry charging through the air in companies fully armed with lances and drawn swords. And so that during this attack, there was this army of horses and chariots that were somehow waging war in the sky above the city. And even Tacitus, the Roman historian, talks about the battle of the Cimbrians, and the same thing happened, where there were visions of these heavenly armies. It was just a symbol of divine judgment is all that's happening. Right. So it's the same thing here. They're just using the language of divine judgment to express what was happening at AD 70.
Yeah, and preterism is really just the negative side of realized eschatology. And so there's really no difference between realized eschatology and preterism, except realized eschatology focuses on the positive stuff. Preterism focuses on the negative stuff.
It's the drunk uncle
of Jewish eschatology, right? And so you'll get guys like Don Preston, Ken Gentry that will say, "Well, N.T. Wright is doing a great job. He won't take it far enough." He acknowledges that Jesus fulfilled the hopes of Israel. He acknowledges that he inaugurated the eschatology of Israel, but he won't take it to its logical conclusion, and that is full preterism. And so it's really the same thing. And the thing about second century believers is that it seems obvious that they didn't get the point. If 70 AD really was the spiritual actualization of the Jewish narrative in the first century, then it's obvious that second century believers did not catch on. And so if you ever read, like, for example, Everett Ferguson, who is, he's probably one of the most famous patristic scholars, and you read his stuff on second century Christianity, it's not necessarily really Jewish oriented because of the parting of the ways, so to speak, between Gentile believers and the rabbinic movement after that. But it's definitely eschatological, and the second century believers have almost no notion of realized eschatology in their writings. If you actually read what believers in the second century wrote, there's no hint of realized eschatology almost at all. And so that really speaks a lot to me on a number of levels, that probably if the second century believers hadn't caught on, then it's probably not actually there in the first century. And the second century believers are the ones doing the hard work of canonization. Like, they're the ones actually picking the material, and they pick what we have in the New Testament, and they all in the second century believed it to be eschatological and futuristic. But now you'll get theologians that will read back, and they'll kind of, when they address second century stuff, they'll go, oh, well, they just didn't really catch on, I guess, to what was really happening in Jesus and the apostles. And it just makes your head hurt, because it's like, wait, how
They knew the apostles.
These are the guys, right? These are the guys who gave us the Bible, exactly. and they don't know anything about realized eschatology. It's really it's bizarre.
Yeah. Well, and Bill, I think you made a great point too in saying that how these even going back to the story of Cyrus and the return of the Jews to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple under Cyrus, and seeing, I think for me, looking at even just the simple pattern that we see even developed all the way back in Deuteronomy, and the pattern and the outworking of the covenant of how God intends to one day bring an end to this pattern or this cycle, which is Israel's covenant breaking. God sends discipline in the form of military aggression or things like that. And then they repent and return for a time, but then eventually they turn aside and go after other gods again. And this pattern seems to happen over and over and over and over again. Yet Moses and the prophets anticipate a final climactic end to that cycle and to that pattern by a divine intervention of God on the day of God, right? But when the Messiah comes, defeats Israel's enemies, Israel's power and strength is gone. And this pattern is just the pattern that plays out through the prophets, the pattern that also then plays out in 70 AD. And I think that, as you said, the apostles, and as you mentioned, John, the second century disciples of the apostles are continuing to push these things to their ultimate end, and saying, okay, well, this didn't happen. Well, this seems similar. Clearly it's divine judgment, but it's simply in the pattern that Moses has laid out in the Torah. And I think to not understand that is to get to the point where you go, oh, well, clearly everything was fulfilled in 70 AD. It's just not recognizing the pattern that has played out throughout the Torah and the prophets, and throughout Israel's history. But again, all getting pushed to its ultimate end. So
very good.
Great. All right, we're going to do a little rapid fire round of questions here. Dun, dun, dun. So quick little question and quick little answer. So the first,
do this.
Yeah, we can do this. Ready, guys? Here we go. First one, is how do you define Israel?
Biological descendants of Abraham. And Romans 9, 6, not all are Israel or Israel, is just talking about not all biological descendants have the faith of their forefather. Not all Rolexes are Rolexes. The same with the Israel of God in Galatians 6. But beyond that, whatever the 70 times Israel is in the New Testament, it's just every time it's the biological descendants of Abraham.
Here we go. Second question in rapid fire. Who is the bride of Christ?
I'll do that one. So I would answer this way. We all have different opinions even here. I answer this way. My general hermeneutic is if it's clear coming into the first century, I need a good reason to change it. So I still think the bride of Christ is still a reference to, again, the descendants of Abraham. But from the Torah onward, you had groups of individual Gentiles who were clinging to that people and to their God in light of the hope. So Bride of Christ, I still think is references redeemed Israel.
Next question. What do you think of the author Matthew Bates and his book Salvation by Allegiance Alone? In particular, how can his definition or use of pistis, how can that be framed within the Jewish apocalyptic framework?
I'll do that one too. I'm a little bit familiar with Bates. So a lot of the premise is, a lot of the work he does on pistis is actually pretty sharp. He frames it within like more of a governmental framework than a religious framework, that it should be seen as like governmental allegiance to a king, which is great. The framework that he comes from is realized eschatology. So where the point is that Jesus has been enthroned and his kingdom is advancing right now. So the whole application is doing it in terms of Jesus' present reign. So that makes it really hard to really digest a lot of what he says, in my opinion. But as far as the use of pistis as a sense of allegiance to Jesus, I think there's definitely some passages in the New Testament where that is explicit, where you could actually use it that way. So some of it, I think, is somewhat helpful.
That's good. All right, next question. I'm completely on board with everything in this podcast, but I'm wondering if there's a point where it starts to become Gnosticism if we need extra clarification from Second Temple literature or surrounding Near Eastern worldviews to truly understand the text. In other words, is it possible to take context into account too heavily?
Well, Gnosticism assumes that you have to be a particularly spiritual or gifted human being to understand what's being said. And so we're definitely not Gnostic, because we would say that it's usually the unbelievers in the academy that are saying this, not the believers.
Yeah.
And it's not a complicated worldview. It's a very simplistic worldview moving towards a climactic end. And it's not difficult to understand or figure out. It's also not difficult to see it in the New Testament. The two main things that make Jews different, when all human beings are human beings, we all have the same fear, anxiety, etc. But what makes a first century Jew different than us today is primarily how they viewed the universe and how they viewed the future. And so once those two things are clarified, then it's pretty simple to understand. And you see it in the New Testament, but there are those big phrases that simply aren't defined. They're assumed. The day of judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the kingdom of God, and Gehenna are used without explanation. And so it makes sense to interpret them that way, but if you get into an argument about it, it turns into circular reasoning real quick without historical context.
Yeah, agreed.
I'm gonna break the rule and do 15 seconds of my own on this one. So Becky, I totally sympathize with your question. And let me just put it like this. Sometimes as a pastor, I know people that get into conflicts with one another. Oh, but that's not what I mean, but that's not, and almost always the solution is you need to get to know each other and find out where you're coming from and understand where they're talking from. So that's all we're really saying.
Get to know a first century Jew? Is that what you mean?
Hey,
man, if I had the opportunity.
That'd be awesome. All right, last one in the rapid fire round. I would like you gentlemen to tackle or comment on Rashi and how the reformers were influenced by his commentaries on the Old Testament.
So Rashi, so he basically came up with a hermeneutic known as Peshat, and it's more of like a spiritualized hermeneutic of looking at the text, and I've read some arguments, like Riddlenick's argument that it was really influential on the reformers, and that maybe that has played out into right now. And I just like to say that I think modern churches generally hold this kind of view that they do because of higher criticism out of Germany, and not really. I don't really see a direct link to Rashi and that hermeneutic anymore. But that's just my reading. I'm not super in depth on it, but that's just my looking at it.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. Well, I think we're out of time for today. We just want to sum up maybe just a few of the big takeaways from our last podcast or last series of podcasts from the last Q&A episode to this one, which would really be episodes 7 through 12. And we worked through Acts 1 and Acts 2. We talked about the restoration of the kingdom to Israel and the gift of the Spirit, all seeing that continuing within a first century Jewish apocalyptic framework. We talked about how the apostles would have read for instance, the Psalms, like we looked through Peter's sermon in Acts 2 and talked about Psalm 16 and Psalm 110, and saw how they were, Peter was almost, I guess we kind of made it an adjective or a verb rather. He was apocalypticizing those passages and pushing them to their ultimate end. We spent a couple of episodes talking about the cross within the first century Jewish apocalyptic framework and how those things sat and squarely within that framework as well. And we spent some time really looking at our so whats, our application points, like what we do in light of these things. We saw really what the gift of the Holy Spirit was about and it being a down payment and the guarantee of the coming inheritance and the resurrection of the dead. We talked about the importance of trusting in the cross and boasting only in the cross, and how as believers and as disciples, that is really the only way forward. So we've got a couple of other upcoming episodes right after this one that we're going to begin to work through the discipleship of the Gentiles and God's heart for the Gentiles in Acts 10 and Acts 15. And so definitely, we hope you can join us for those. But we want to finish this episode just by saying, hey, what can we do better? We don't claim to know everything about doing podcasts and how to talk about these things and what encourages you the best or what you're still confused by. So if you have comments on what we can do better, please drop us a note through the contact form on our website, apocalypticgospel.com. We would love to hear from you. Or if you've been encouraged, we would definitely love to hear from you as well. So guys, this has been great. We hope you as our listeners have been encouraged. God bless, and thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. Maranatha.
Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.